Maria Paris and her boyfriend, Hoi Ngo, were sitting and talking inside their vehicle when they were carjacked by a group of 5 assailants in Houston, Texas in June of 2005. The carjackers forced the couple into the back seat of the vehicle at gunpoint and then drove around the city while demanding their money, ATM and credit cards and PIN numbers. They then drove to a wooded area where one of the kidnappers viciously assaulted Paris while the other captors taunted Ngo while forcing him to listen to the attack. The victims were then marched into the woods and shot in the head. Paris and Ngo were killed in the midst of a violent crime spree that was carried out at the hands of their killers. Among the 5 was an 18-year-old brain-damaged schizophrenic man named Dexter Darnell Johnson, who was identified as the shooter of at least one of the victims. Johnson was also implicated in 2 other murders that were committed during the crime spree. In 2007, he was found guilty of Paris's murder and sentenced to death. During his sentencing hearing, Johnson became visibly angry upon learning that he was being condemned to death row. He could be seen knocking over a chair while his family members screamed in disbelief, and 2 people were taken away by ambulance after collapsing in the courtroom. Johnson challenged his case, but it didn't seem promising. In 2018, an execution date was set for the then 30-year-old. The following year, just 1 day before Johnson was scheduled to die, the U.S. Court of Appeals granted a life-saving stay of execution. His lawyers were given 90 days to come up with evidence to back up their claims that his previous counsel was ineffective. More than 6 years later, records show that Johnson remains on death row. The current status on his attempts to get off death row completely remains unclear. Number 15. Krista Pike. In early 1995, 18-year-old Job Corps trainee Krista Gale Pike became convinced that a fellow student, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, was interested in her boyfriend. Determined to teach Slemmer a lesson, Pike, her boyfriend, and a friend lured her to an abandoned steam plant near the campus in Knoxville, Tennessee, with false promises to make peace and smoke marijuana together. Instead, the trio mercilessly attacked Slemmer. For 30 minutes, the assailants beat, taunted, and slashed the young woman. They carved a pentagram into Slemmer's chest, cut her in the back when she tried running away, and hurled rocks at her as she begged for her life. In what could perhaps be best described as a gruesome grand finale, Pike fatally smashed Slemmer's head with a piece of asphalt, then kept a piece of the victim's skull as a souvenir. She even showed it off to her friends and acquaintances afterward, making it clear that she was proud of what she had done. When questioned by police, Pike admitted to luring Slemmer to the crime scene but denied planning ahead of time to kill the victim. She claimed she panicked after realizing that the situation had spiraled out of control, causing her to fear that she would be kicked out of the Job Corps if Slemmer survived and reported the assault. But no explanation could possibly excuse Pike's actions in the eyes of the law or a jury, and in 1996 she was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death by electrocution, but has not been executed. At the age of 48, she's currently Tennessee's only woman on death row. In addition to the murder conviction, she was found guilty of attempted murder in 2004 for trying to strangle a fellow inmate to death with a shoestring. If and when Pike's execution does occur, she'll be the first woman to be put to death in the state in over 200 years. Number 14. Terrence Andrus. Terrence Andrus was just 20 years old when he got high on PCP and fatally shot 2 people during a series of attempted carjackings in Houston, Texas in 2008. He already had a criminal record dating back at least 4 years when he was arrested for robbery and incarcerated in a juvenile facility. Theoretically, the teen's punishment was meant to rehabilitate him, provide him with job skills, and prevent him from committing future crimes. But Andrus had a much different experience during his time in lockup, during which he was exposed to gangs and heavily dosed with psychiatric medications. He was also locked in solitary confinement at least 77 times. Andrus's defense attorneys highlighted these factors in their attempts to convince the court to spare him from capital punishment after the deadly carjackings, but he was nevertheless sentenced to death. He appealed his case, and in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered a Texas state court to reconsider his punishment. In their attempts to save their client's life, Andrus's lawyers urged the court to consider his difficult upbringing, including the trauma and lack of meaningful rehabilitation he experienced in juvenile detention. But the state court was unsympathetic to the young man's plight, and the death penalty was upheld. Andrus continued to challenge his case, but the state court refused to review it for a second time, and he remained condemned to death row. He eventually lost hope that his sentence would be commuted to life without parole, and in early 2023, roughly 6 months after the state court declined to review his case, he was found dead in his prison cell. Anti-death penalty activists cite cases like this involving young defendants with troubled pasts as examples of why they believe capital punishment is morally wrong. Others believe that Andrus was exactly where he belonged and that there's no such thing as a mitigating factor when it comes to the nature of the crimes that land people on death row. Number 13. Paula Cooper. Paula Cooper of Gary, Indiana, was just 15 years old when she was sentenced to death by electrocution for stabbing 78-year-old Ruth Pelker to death during a home burglary. The murder occurred during the spring of 1985 after Cooper and her friends Karen, April, and Denise decided to skip class. They went to April's house and drank on her front porch, which on its surface may seem like harmless teenage shenanigans. But there was a more sinister side to the friend group's delinquent behavior. Just days earlier, the girls had broken into a neighbor's house and stolen $90. Most of the money was gone, and they were now concocting their next plan to get their hands on some quick cash. Pelker, who lived nearby, quickly came to mind as an ideal target. In addition to being a senior citizen, she was widowed, lived alone, and was a Bible study teacher, which gave the girls the idea of pretending they wanted a Bible lesson as a way to gain entry into her home. Armed with a 12-inch knife, Cooper, Karen, and Denise went over to Pelker's house while April waited at home. Pelker was receptive to their requests for information about Bible classes and quickly let them into her residence. As she wrote down the details, Cooper ambushed her from behind, knocking her to the floor. She then grabbed a paperweight and smashed Pelker on the head with it, then stabbed the elderly woman at least 30 times with the foot-long blade she had carried with her in her coat pocket. Despite the heinousness of Cooper's actions, many opposed the court's decision to condemn her to death row due to her young age. The punishment even captured the attention of the Pope at the time, John Paul II, who urged clemency. Cooper's attorneys challenged her case, arguing that the teenage brain does not understand the difference between right and wrong the way an adult mind does, and that their client was a different person than she was when she murdered Pelker. At the age of 19, Cooper was resentenced to 60 years with the possibility of parole. By then, she was working toward a college degree and had shown that she had the capacity to be rehabilitated. She was released in 2013 at the age of 43 after serving 26 years behind bars. Number 12. Austin Myers. 18-year-old Justin Michael Back was just months out of high school and was preparing to enter the U.S. Navy when he was murdered at his Waynesville, Ohio home in January of 2014. The killers were none other than his high school classmate, Austin Gregory Myers, and another young man named Timothy E. Mosley. Myers and Mosley had initially planned to rob the residence, where they believed Back's stepfather kept $20,000 cash locked in a safe, but they called the robbery off after driving to the residence and realizing that Back was home. While re-strategizing, the culprits decided to kill Back in order to gain access to the safe. Armed with a garrote and a 6-inch pocket knife, Myers and Mosley returned to Back's home. They talked with Back for a while before ambushing him from behind. Myers strangled Back with the garrote while Mosley stabbed him more than 20 times with the pocket knife, killing him at the scene. The pair then attempted to clean up the crime scene and ransacked the house, stealing the safe along with some jewelry and credit cards. They placed Back's body into the trunk of their car with plans to make it look as though he had run away from home and dumped the remains in a field in neighboring Preble County. Much to their dismay, the safe did not contain anything of immense value. Moreover, the killers had not done as good of a job as they thought covering up their crime. Eyewitness accounts placed their distinctive-looking car at Back's residence, and they quickly fell at the top of the suspects list, even before the victim's body was found. Myers attempted to pin the robbery and murder squarely on Mosley, who confessed to his role in the crime but pointed at Myers as the mastermind. As the result of a plea bargain, Mosley was sentenced to life without parole, while Myers chose to take his case to trial. During jailhouse phone calls and visits while awaiting trial, Myers bragged and laughed about making international news headlines. He also entertained the idea of profiting off his crime by having his friends post videos about it on YouTube, demonstrating a blatant lack of remorse for his actions. Myers was found guilty, and in October of 2014 he became the youngest inmate on death row in Ohio. There haven't been any executions in the state since 2018, leaving the future of Myers and other condemned inmates uncertain. Number 11. Brandon Bernard. Brandon Anthony Micah Bernard was 18 years old when he and 5 teenage co-conspirators kidnapped, robbed, and murdered 26-year-old youth pastor Todd Bagley and his wife, 28-year-old youth pastor Stacy Bagley, in 1999. The suspects approached the couple outside a gas station in Killeen, Texas, and asked them for a ride. As soon as the Bagleys agreed, the teens forced them into the trunk of their vehicle at gunpoint and stole their car. For several hours, the Bagleys urged their captors to accept Jesus into their hearts and spare their lives. Instead of accommodating the couple's desperate pleas, however, the abductors stole Todd and Stacy's jewelry and used their ATM card to withdraw cash. They then drove to a recreational area where they shot the victims in the head and set the car ablaze. Because the crimes took place at the Fort Hood U.S. Army post, the suspects were tried for their crimes in federal court. Bernard and one of his co-defendants, Christopher Villalva, were found guilty of murdering the Bagleys and sentenced to death. The 3 other defendants took plea deals and received sentences ranging from 5 years to just under 21 years in prison. Villalva was executed in September of 2020. Prior to being put to death, he made a last-ditch plea for clemency, stating that he committed a grave wrong as a lost kid and took 2 precious lives. While his words demonstrated an understanding of his wrongdoings, he failed to convince the authorities to reconsider his punishment. Bernard was executed 3 months later, in December of 2020. At 40 years old, he was the youngest person to be put to death for a crime he committed at the age of 18 in 70 years. In his final statement, he apologized for his actions and the pain the victims' loved ones suffered. The executions of Villalva and Bernard were among 7 federal death sentences that were carried out over a several-month period in 2020, in addition to being the highest number of executions in that amount of time in nearly a century. The decisions to carry out the punishments were controversial due to Donald Trump's status as a sitting duck president. The executions nevertheless moved forward, reflecting the conservative leader's zero-tolerance approach to crime. Number 10. Damian Wayne Eccles. Next on today's list is Damian Wayne Eccles, who not only managed to avoid death row but regained his freedom entirely after being one of 3 teenagers who were convicted in the murders of 3 children, infamously known as the West Memphis 3. Eccles and his co-defendants Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miss Kelly were found guilty in 1994 despite the lack of physical evidence tying them to the triple homicide. The judge sentenced Eccles to death by lethal injection. He fought his case with every resource that was available to him, but no major headway was made until 2007 when newly available DNA testing technology determined that hairs found at the crime scene did not belong to any of the West Memphis 3. Even then, however, Eccles failed to garner a new hearing after the case went before the same judge who had sentenced him to death. Finally, in 2010, Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly were granted an evidentiary hearing based on the new DNA findings. The following year, Eccles' defense attorneys negotiated an Alford plea, which meant that he was able to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors may have a strong enough case to secure a conviction against him. As a result, all 3 defendants were resentenced to time served and immediately released from prison. After regaining his freedom, Eccles and his wife relocated to New York City, where he became a vocal advocate for the condemned. He is also a best-selling author of several autobiographical books, including Life After Death, which was published in 2012. Number 9. Damante Graham. On Super Bowl Sunday in February 2016, 19-year-old Damante Graham of Akron, Ohio, and 2 teenage accomplices robbed a marijuana dealer named Connor Haithcock at his apartment. The trio decided to commit the crime after one of the conspirators noticed on a previous occasion that Haithcock kept substantial amounts of cash at the residence. Armed with semi-automatic handguns, Graham and his accomplices barged into the apartment. During the robbery, Graham shot a visitor, 18-year-old Kent State University student Nicholas Massa, in the chest. Witnesses ran from the room and the intruders fled the scene. Later that year, Graham was convicted of 6 felonies, including aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, and 3 counts of kidnapping. Additionally, the court found that the aggravating factors of the case outweighed any mitigating factors that were present, including the defendant's impoverished childhood and struggles with substance abuse. At the conclusion of the trial, Graham became the youngest person ever sentenced to death in Portage County. While imposing the punishment, Judge Laurie Pittman said that she tried to find humanity in Graham's eyes, but found none, describing the murder as a senseless act. She further stated that she had a clear conscience about her decision to impose the death penalty. Graham declined to speak during the sentencing hearing, despite being given 2 chances to do so, and he showed no emotion throughout the proceeding. In accordance with Ohio law, Graham was granted an automatic appeal of his case. 4 years later, in 2020, the state Supreme Court overturned the convicted killer's death sentence. The decision came after the court concluded that the aggravating circumstances of the crime did not outweigh the mitigating factors beyond a reasonable doubt. Graham's convictions stood, however, and in early 2021 he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 8. Emilia Carr. In a love triangle that took a deadly turn, 24-year-old Emilia Carr of Citra, Florida, was 8 months pregnant when her fiancé, Joshua Damian Fulgham, married another woman named Heather Strong in November 2008. Carr initially maintained cordial contact with Fulgham and Strong, even babysitting Strong's 2 young children for the couple. But the situation took a bitter turn, and in January of 2009, Carr was arrested for threatening Strong with a shotgun. Carr was initially charged with aggravated assault with a firearm, but the case was dropped after Strong decided not to cooperate with the authorities. It would later be discovered that Carr had threatened Strong at knife point into withdrawing her complaint. Apparently fed up with the drama, Strong began seeing another man while Carr and Fulgham rekindled their relationship. During that time, she became entangled in a custody battle with Fulgham over their 2 children. In February 2009, Strong vanished. About a month later, her remains were found in a shallow grave near a storage trailer behind Carr's mother's home in northern Marion County. Following the discovery, Carr made numerous suspicious statements to the police. She also incriminated herself during a conversation with Fulgham's sister about the crime, which was captured in an audio recording. According to these accounts and the evidence, Carr, who was 7 months pregnant with Fulgham's child at the time, lured Strong to the storage trailer and bound her to a chair with duct tape. When she failed to break Strong's neck, she suffocated the victim to death with a plastic bag. Both Carr and Fulgham were charged with Strong's murder. The prosecution immediately notified the court of their intention to seek the death penalty, and in late 2010 a jury found Carr guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping, after deliberating for just 2.5 hours. Several months later, the jury sentenced her to death by lethal injection with a majority 7-5 vote. Fulgham was found guilty but was sentenced to life without parole rather than the death penalty. Following the verdicts, Carr appealed her case. In 2017, she was resentenced to life without parole, sparing her from the dismal existence that comes with life on death row in the state of Florida. Number 7. Ricky DuBose. Ricky DuBose was already serving a 20-year prison sentence for armed robbery, aggravated assault, and theft when he and a fellow inmate, Donnie Russell Rowe, escaped from a prisoner bus in Georgia. In June of 2017, DuBose had been sentenced in 2014 while Rowe was serving a sentence of up to life for an armed robbery and aggravated assault he committed back in 2001. The pair somehow broke out of a gated section of the bus where they were riding with 31 other inmates and entered the driver's section, where they overpowered, disarmed and shot corrections officers Christopher Monica and Curtis Billou. During the nearly 3-day nationwide manhunt that ensued, DuBose and Rowe stole 5 vehicles, robbed 2 homes, robbed and terrorized an elderly couple, and led police on a harrowing chase, reaching speeds as high as 100 miles per hour. The pursuit finally ended after the fugitives lost control of the stolen vehicle they were driving and crashed, at which point some armed civilians held them at gunpoint until law enforcement reached the scene. In 2022, DuBose was convicted of murdering officers Monica and Billou and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Instead of facing life on death row and owning up to the consequences set forth by the law, he decided to take fate into his own hands and was found dead in his prison cell just 10 days after being found guilty. Rowe was also found guilty of both murders and was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, which he is currently serving in the Tennessee State Prison System. Number 6. Ronald Ray Howard. During what began as a routine traffic stop along a rural road in Jackson County, Texas, in April of 1992, State Trooper Bill Davidson pulled over 18-year-old Ronald Ray Howard for having a headlight out. Howard was already a convicted car thief and drug dealer, and the vehicle he was driving was stolen. Instead of cooperating with Trooper Davidson, he shot the lawman in the neck and fled the scene. Davidson died from his injuries and Howard was picked up by law enforcement several hours after the crime. In his possession was the murder weapon, a 9mm handgun, which was loaded with the same hollow point bullets that had caused Davidson's fatal neck wound. Howard confessed to the crime during police questioning and again in front of a grand jury, and was charged accordingly with Davidson's murder. During his trial, it was revealed that he had cocaine and marijuana in his system at the time of the shooting. His defense attorney, Alan Tanner, fought against the prosecution's pursuit of the death penalty, citing his client's difficult upbringing and addiction to gangster rap as mitigating factors in the case. In 1993, Howard was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, and the punishment was upheld on appeal. He was executed in October 2005 at the age of 32. During his final statement, he looked at the victim's family and said that he hoped that this helps a little. Howard also expressed his love toward his family, including 2 of his children who visited him on death row in the week leading up to his execution. Number 5. Robert Acuna. 17-year-old Robert Acuna was still in high school when he shot his elderly neighbors, James and Joyce Carroll, execution style, inside the victim's Baytown, Texas home in November of 2003. He then stole the senior citizen's car and drove nearly 4 hours to Dallas. Police arrested the teen 5 days later at a motel where they found the Carrolls' car, some of their belongings, and the .38 caliber pistol that had been used to murder them in cold blood. At the time, the US Supreme Court was debating whether or not capital punishment is appropriate for convicted killers who were under 18 years of age at the time of their crime. The prosecution nevertheless urged the jury to find Acuna guilty and impose the death penalty. During Acuna's 8-day trial in April 2004, he never offered an explanation for his actions. Despite this, which many saw as a display of remorselessness, his defense attorney Robert Loper argued that young folks make bad decisions. Loper went on to state, "You can't look across the table and say he's the kind of person who needs to be extinguished from the face of the earth." The jury disagreed and honored the prosecution's desire to condemn Acuna to death row, but the US Supreme Court eventually decided that it is, in fact, unconstitutional to impose capital punishment on someone who committed their crime as a minor. As a result, Acuna was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 14 years. He'll be 58 years old when he becomes eligible for release in 2044. Number 4. George Stinney Jr. George Stinney Jr. was just 14 years old when he was arrested for murder in 1944 in the racially segregated South Carolina town of Alcolu. He was accused of murdering 2 white girls who had been bludgeoned over the head with a railroad spike and dumped in a ditch. Suspicion fell on Stinney after police learned that he and his younger sister were the last known individuals to see the victims alive. He was questioned without his parents or an attorney present at a time when a right to counsel was not guaranteed to US citizens. And while police claimed that the young man confessed to the murders, no one will ever truly know what went on in that interrogation room, especially since there's no written record of Stinney's alleged confession. After a 2-hour trial during which no defense witnesses were called and just 10 minutes of deliberation, an all-white jury convicted Stinney of the double homicide. His lawyer chose not to appeal and he was executed via the electric chair just 3 months later, making him the youngest American in modern times to be put to death. With a lack of damning evidence, Stinney's guilt was highly questionable from the get-go. The teen's family claimed that he had an alibi that the authorities never looked into. Additionally, Stinney adamantly denied the crime to his cellmate, Wilford Hunter, who recalled Stinney saying, I didn't do it. But these factors were easy for those in power to overlook in the Jim Crow South, and it resulted in the execution of an innocent African-American teenager. In 2014, Stinney was posthumously exonerated, and while it doesn't represent justice in a traditional sense, it was the best possible way to right a historical wrong which had haunted the region for 70 years. Number 3. Taylor Parker. Police in New Boston, Texas, encountered a horrifying scene one morning in October of 2020 when they found 21-year-old expectant mother Reagan Michelle Simmons Hancock dead with her baby removed from her body. She was 34 weeks into her pregnancy when she was murdered by someone who wanted to steal her child. Around the same time, Texas state troopers conducted a traffic stop and found a woman named Taylor Parker holding a newborn infant with the umbilical cord still attached. For several months, Taylor's boyfriend, friends, and family were all under the impression that she was pregnant, but she wasn't. And in an attempt to uphold her false narrative, she had cut open Simmons's abdomen and stolen her infant. Sadly, the baby didn't survive and Parker was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty, arguing that the defendant would never change, while the defense blamed Parker's behavior on unaddressed trauma from her past. She was found guilty and became one of just 7 women on death row in the state of Texas. Parker was the first woman in Texas to be condemned to death since a decade earlier. As of 2024, none of the state's female death row inmates are scheduled for execution. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and maybe it will be your video that we'll be doing next. Number 2. Juan Raul Navarro Ramirez. In what became known as the Edinburgh Massacre, Juan Raul Navarro Ramirez and 10 accomplices forced their way into an Edinburgh, Texas home in January of 2003 for the purpose of stealing a large quantity of marijuana. During the home invasion, he and his co-conspirators fatally shot 6 Hispanic men. Only one of the victims survived to tell about the events of that day. Juan Delgado Villa dove through a window and ran for his life as gunshots rang out in his wake, but he refused to testify in court, most likely out of fear. The culprits were members of the Tri-City Bombers gang. After the massacre, they were all charged with capital murder. Ramirez, who was 20 years old at the time, was the youngest among the defendants. He was also the first among them to go to trial, and he was sentenced to death despite pleading his innocence. In the years since his conviction and sentencing, Ramirez has continued fighting in an attempt to clear his name. In 2021, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied his request to have evidence DNA tested. The court argued that even if the evidence, which consists of several clothing items, had been tested, it would not have cleared Ramirez of the crime that he's convicted of. As of 2024, the now 40-year-old remains on death row with no execution date set. Number 1. Charles Chucky Rumbaugh. Charles Chucky Rumbaugh wasn't even legally an adult when he fatally shot an Amarillo, Texas-based jeweler named Michael Fiorello in 1975. The murder occurred after he entered Fiorello's shop and demanded money at gunpoint. Unwilling to concede to the robber's demands, Fiorello fought back, leading to a struggle between the two men, during which Rumbaugh decided to pull the trigger. For Rumbaugh, the murder came on the heels of a life of dysfunction. He had spent the vast majority of his upbringing in mental institutions, jails, and reform schools, but a federal criminal court took no mercy on him when he was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to death. Rumbaugh was executed by lethal injection a decade later at the age of 28 years old, making him the 48th federally condemned inmate to be put to death since the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976. Additionally, it was the first federal execution of an inmate who committed their crime before the age of 18 to be carried out in 2 decades. Rumbaugh's final words reflected a lack of remorse for his actions. During his last statement, he said, "Although you don't forgive me for my transgressions, I forgive yours against me. I am ready to begin my journey, and that's all I have to say." Thanks for watching. Would you rather spend the rest of your life on death row or homeless and penniless in North Korea? And why? Let us know in the comments section below.